Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew an easy Grim Reaper costume using our new Tailors Gone Wild Medieval Monk / Grim Reaper sewing pattern. You make...
Okay. You make both costumes the exact same way. It's just one's brown and the other's black. I'll be using black linen to demonstrate, but of course you can use whatever you like. Anyway, the pattern is available at www.tailorsgonewild.com, both as a physical copy and a digital download. So let's get started. Remember to flip the robe sleeve, piece C, along the horizontal center before cutting the fabric. The sleeve is symmetrical, so only half the sleeve is on the printed pattern. If I'd have done the whole sleeve, that would have meant another pattern page, so I wanted to try and save you a few bucks if I could. So only half the sleeve is on the printed pattern. Sew the robe front, piece A, to the robe back, piece B, along the sides and shoulders, right sides together with 5/8 inch seam allowance. If you have a serger, the easiest way to manage these seam allowances is to serge them together. Then press the seam allowances toward the back. However, if you don't have a serger, that's completely fine. There are a couple other good options you can do if you only have a sewing machine. You could flat fell the seam allowances, or do what I call a faux flat fell seam. Carefully trim the back seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Press the front seam allowance in half toward the seam line. Then press the front seam allowance toward the back so it covers the back seam allowance that you trimmed. Edge stitch the folded seam allowance into place close to the folded edge. Then press the seam again. That's probably the easiest and most effective way, but you could also sew these with French seams. Just for demonstration purposes, I've applied a strip of white fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. You don't want to actually use a fusible interfacing for this because it would bulk up the seam, but since linen looks the same on both sides, I wanted it to be obvious which were the right and wrong sides of the fabric. So when you see the white fusible, we're looking at the wrong side of the fabric. First, place the two fabric panels wrong sides together. Ordinarily we sew seams with the right sides together, but for this seam we start with the wrong sides together. Sew the two pieces together with 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim these seam allowances down to 1/8 inch. Fold the panels away from each other and press them at the seam line. Then fold the panels back together along the seam line, right sides together, and press. Sew the pieces together 1/4 inch from the folded edge. Press these enclosed seam allowances toward the back. Then edge stitch the allowances into place close to the folded edge, just like I showed you earlier for the faux flat fell seam. Press the seam one more time. Both of these options are a bit more work than just serging them, but they both protect all the seam allowances and look about the same when they're finished. You wind up with an extra strong seam and a row of top stitching parallel to it. Sew the robe sleeve, piece C, closed along the inner sleeve, right sides together with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Serge the seam allowances together, or enclose them however you like. Press the seam allowances toward the back. I like to go ahead and hem the sleeves at this point before they're attached. If you want to as well, turn up the lower edge of the sleeve 1/4 inch and press. Then turn and press it upward 1/4 inch again. Edge stitch the hem allowance into place close to the folded edge. Of course, if you're experienced with hemming, you can skip the pressing and pinning and fold the allowances as you go. Either way, press the hem allowance after stitching. Turn the sleeve right side out. With the robe still inside out, insert the sleeve into the corresponding armscye, also known as the armhole. Pin the sleeve into place, matching the sleeve's horizontal center with the body shoulder seam and matching side/inner seams. Sew the sleeve to the body with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Serge the seam allowances together. Ordinarily, we'd want to press the armscye seam, but for this particular costume, I actually prefer to leave it as is. I kind of like the sort of rugged look it has. Pressing it kind of makes it too clean and pretty. Anyway, repeat for the other sleeve. Hem the bottom of the robe by pressing the edge under 1/4 inch, then 1/4 inch again in edge stitching, like I showed you for the sleeve. And like I mentioned, I usually prefer to just fold hems like this as I go. Press the hem after stitching. For the neckline, I do prefer to press the hem allowances under because it's such a curve all the way around. The first 1/4 inch is pretty easy, but you may need to coax the second 1/4 inch a little. Edge stitch the neckline hem into place as well. Then press the finished hem. That's it for the robe. Now let's make the belt. There's a pattern piece for the belt, piece D, but it's just a long rectangle 3 inches wide. The length is your natural waist, plus about 40 inches. And remember that the belt should actually be twice as long as the paper pattern piece. Even the huge page wasn't nearly long enough for the entire belt. Or you could cut 2 of them and add a center back seam, but I prefer one long piece. Press the longer edges of the belt under 1/2 inch. Unfold the pressed allowances and fold the belt back on itself, right sides together. Sew the shorter ends of the belt closed, right sides together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Turn the ends of the belt right sides out again. I like to start with my finger, then use a corner turner to gently turn out the corner. Turn the 1/2 inch allowances back under at the ends and press the corners flat. Press the rest of the belt in half so the longer folded edges are flush. Pin these edges together. Edge stitch the longer open ends of the belt together. Press the entire belt flat. And that's it for the belt. If you have a serger, serge the center front and center back edges of the right and left mantle, piece A. Sew the right and left mantelpieces together along the center front and center back, right sides together with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowances open. However, if you don't have a serger, that's completely fine. I suggest sewing the seams and pressing the seam allowances open just like you normally would. Then fold the seam allowances back on themselves toward the seam line, with the raw edge sandwiched between the layers. From the underside, edge stitch the allowances into place close to the folded edges. Press the seam allowances again. You do wind up with a little bit more bulk in the seam and a couple rows of top stitching on the outside, but I think it still looks fine. You can barely see the stitching on more textured fabrics like linen anyway. To hem the mantle, press the lower curved edge under 1/4 inch. Then press it under 1/4 inch again. You can also pin the hem allowance into place if you like. Edge stitch the hem allowance into place from the underside. Press the finished hem. That's it for the mantle. Now we'll move on to the hood. Sew the hood, piece B, closed along the center back, right sides together with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Serge the seam allowances together. If you don't have a serger, I'd recommend enclosing these allowances with some bias tape or seam binding. Press the seam allowances to one side. Either side is fine. When you get to the corner, just do your best and try not to press any creases into the hood itself. Trim away the allowances diagonally at the corner. Turn the hood right sides out. To hem the hood front, press the front edge under 1/4 inch, then 1/4 inch again and edge stitch the hem allowance into place from the underside. Of course, if you're experienced with hemming, you can skip the pressing and pinning and fold the allowances as you go. Press the finished hem. The hood is now ready to be attached to the mantle. With the mantle inside out, insert the hood into the mantle neckline. Pin the hood into place with the front edges of the hood flush at the mantle center front and matching center back seams. Baste across the center front and center back. Check to make sure everything lines up properly at these areas. Once you're satisfied with the alignments, sew the hood to the mantle with 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around, reinforcing your stitching several times at the center front. I like to do another reinforced stitch 1/8 of an inch inside the first at the center front to help keep the front edges of the hood from ever pulling or tearing open. You can also do a bar tack there instead. Serge the hood/mantle seam allowances together along the neckline and press them downward. Again, if you don't have a serger, I suggest binding these seam allowances. From the outside, edge stitch or top stitch the hood/mantle seam allowances into place along the neckline. Press the finished neckline area. I like to press this from the outside over a tailor's hem, so be sure to use a press cloth or a protective shoe on your iron. That's it. You're all finished. I hope you enjoyed this sewing tutorial. Again, the sewing pattern for this is available on our website, www.tailorsgonewild.com. If you're interested in learning more about sewing, check out our sewing courses there too. They're specifically for people who want to make costumes, and a great way to level up your sewing game. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.